I'm just gonna say it. Order 66 is my favourite scene in all of fiction. It is great for so many reasons. Any of those reasons alone would have made the scene quite good, but they all come together to make it what I would sincerely argue to be the best scene in the entire Star Wars IP. But why? Why is it so great? And why does it make us feel this horrible, crushing dread every time we see it referenced in the games and shows? Really, there are three main reasons why Order 66 is so great, so I'll be breaking each one down in its own part of this video, and let's crack on with part 1. How to break the audience's heart. I think it's worthwhile putting us in the shoes of the people who saw this scene for the first time in 2005. The thing that would have caught them off guard the most was how unexpectedly dark it was. By all means, the filmers had been willing to dabble a little in the darkness here and there, like Luke having his hand chopped off by Vader, or Anakin going on that rampage with the Sand People. But it was more than balanced out with levity, with fun, family-friendly adventuring going on, with characters like Jar Jar Binks and the Ewoks as they bumble about. While the IP was never afraid to get a little dark when it mattered, that darkness came sparingly. Like Lucas said himself many times about A New Hope,
it's a film for 12-year-olds.
We went from that, goofy teddy bears and Jar Jar Binks, to this. And what would have made that shock so oddly satisfying was how while it would have been horrifying, it would have also felt inevitable. I mean, in A New Hope, the Jedi Order is ancient history. We only have literally 2 of them left in the galaxy. The Jedi collapsed, and this has been part of the implicit tragedy building through the prequels. We knew the Jedi Order crumbled, we just didn't know how. But as it plays out, as Palpatine says,
"Execute Order 66.
We realise the horrifying truth that Order 66 was the inevitable endpoint. How could it have played out in any other way? Catalysing this strange feeling of being utterly shocked and horrified, yet in a way that feels oddly cathartic because we kind of unconsciously expected something exactly like this to happen. There's something more here, because Order 66 has a really unique power to it. It is a beat for which there is not just no precedent in the Star Wars films, but in fiction. We never have defeats of this magnitude in mainstream stories, where the forces of good aren't just defeated, but annihilated. Like, even now in 2023, it's very rare to have such a total victory of evil over good. The only popular story I can think of here would be Thanos' snap in Infinity War when he kills half of all life, only Order 66 is hands down a more soul-crushing scene, because one franchise fully committed to that tragic twist, letting it define the canon from that point on. So much so, almost 2 decades later, the fans are still grieving for the end of the Jedi Order. Meanwhile, the other wiped it away with a magic wish and resurrected every dead character. But it's so unprecedented. Order 66 for the MCU would be like the entire Avengers with the exception of like Iron Man and Thor all being killed in one swoop, and permanently killed at that. It's such a fresh story beat. It naturally is the case that the more cliche something is, the less evocative it gets. Whenever you don't just break a cliche, but do something unlike anything we've seen before, it gives that moment a certain power that no well-worn idea, no matter how well executed, can ever quite achieve. Going back a bit, this is a classic problem with resurrection in stories. If you kill off Mace Windu in the Jedi Order, for example, and leave them dead, you are going to make your audience really sad for years to come. But if you kill Gandalf, let's say, only to resurrect him in the very next book, while that would be a valid creative choice, if done well, it won't ruin the story by any means. It will, however, make Gandalf's death scene way less powerful in hindsight, undermining how good that scene is, because the main beat of that scene, the death of this character, has just become a damp squib. The obvious point to make around Resurrection is that it may mean death becomes meaningless in that franchise. Why should we be afraid for any character's death when they can routinely come back from it like so easily and without any consequences? But another big critique I have of that trope, which is way more relevant to this video's topic, is that it will also make the scene of their death itself way less powerful for it. Like, George Lucas could have had Mace Windu or Ki-Adi-Mundi somehow survive and come back for another story post Revenge of the Sith, but thank God he didn't, because if he had, like the Infinity War snap or Gandalf's death or any other death scene where the writer got cold feet, the scene itself would be worse for it in retrospect. The fact that Lucas stuck to his guns with the massacre of nearly every Jedi, is another small part of the reason why Order 66 is so great. But there really is an elephant in the room here, because nothing made the scene more heartbreaking than that sense of betrayal, of friends turning against friends. When we see the Jedi care so deeply about the clones, and then for that love to be betrayed so totally, it evokes something powerful within us, that horrid sense of being backstabbed that we feel in our gut. Granted, we didn't see this so much in the films, but this was thoroughly explored in other media such as in the Clone Wars, with the relationship between Ahsoka and Rex, for example. Not to mention her men who all wear her colours as a sign of immense respect for her, making it all the more tragic when those very troops are trying to kill Ahsoka while still wearing her colours. The added context of love and trust existing between the Jedi and the clones only makes Order 66 so much more powerful. It's arguably the thing that gives the moment the majority of its power. That said, it would be wrong to say this context did not exist in the films. We see plenty of signs of this, such as when Obi-Wan emits the honorific when speaking to Commander Cody.
Thank you, Cody. Now let's get a move on. We've got a battle to win here.
Speaking to him as if he's a familiar guy he knows quite well, not a mere soldier under his command, hinting at their good relationship. We see it in Ayla Secura's death, which had a really tragic detail that most people missed. When she's walking with her patrol and the clones raise their guns, her first reaction isn't to turn around like Ki-Adi-Mundi and hold a look of betrayal, it's instead to look around for the enemy they must be aiming at. She trusts them so much, the idea that they were about to betray her didn't even enter her mind. Yoda, meanwhile, gave exactly no fucks and slaughters the clones without batting an eye. As much as I gush about Order 66 being really well done, there is one small gripe I have with it, because it would have been such a lovely touch to have far more glimpses of the clones post Order 66, how they dealt with the fact they slaughtered the Jedi who loved and trusted them. We have had some exploration of that, but I can't help but feel there is plenty more interesting exploration that can happen right here. And oh my god, that scene in Obi-Wan when Kenobi finds that homeless clone, I have never in my entire life seen a bigger waste of storytelling potential than that right there, because Obi-Wan just gives him some money and walks off? What? Like, no! That's not how you handle that scene. Because what if, like, as Obi-Wan gives him the money, the clone recognized him as his old general, and then he just grabs him, and Obi-Wan gets tense, expecting his inhibitor to still be active, expecting him to kill him or scream out that he's a Jedi to the crowd. Instead, the clone hugs him and starts crying, howling out how he's sorry for what he did. And we see what emotional wrecks the clones became after Order 66, because you just murdered the people you loved and respected. Of course the guilt would ruin you as a person. And then we have a mini arc for that episode where the clone starts quite aimless, but he tags along with Obi-Wan, and it's just like old times for the clone as he's reliving the glory days under the command of General Kenobi once more. And then he dies in the end in a heroic blaze of glory. Like, oh my god, like, I'm crying just thinking about it. Who the hell made the Obi-Wan Kenobi show? Whose choice was it to not give us that? No, Henry, stay on track. We're talking about Order 66 today and nothing else. It seems I didn't fully vent my frustration in my How to Save Star Wars video, which is a full deconstruction of the Star Wars shows and why they've gone a bit wrong here and there and how they can be better going forward. If you haven't watched it already, please do click that icon in the top right corner. But all this said, we can go deeper here, because evidently this feeling of betrayal is right at the heart of why Order 66 is just so heartbreaking. It's all well and good to say, well, betrayal makes the audience feel dread, so use use it in your fiction. But I wouldn't be living up to the name of this channel if I didn't at least try to examine why betrayal has this effect in storytelling. My best guess is because to be betrayed is one of the deepest fears most people have. There's a reason why loving people can be very hard sometimes, because love and trust pretty much go hand in hand, and there's a reason why you don't trust everybody you come across, because of the possibility of betrayal. It's because of betrayal's existence as an act people can commit that we're hesitant to love others, and while loving them, are prone to secretly harbour the fear that our love will be betrayed. To be betrayed is the absolute worst case scenario of any relationship. Moments like Order 66 tap into one of the deepest, darkest fears we have, because love is one of perhaps the most important pillar through which we find happiness and meaning in our lives. So to see such betrayal of love is to see our worst nightmares given form. That's why, precisely, I think Order 66 gets us so emotional, but I'm not entirely sure on that theory, so feel free to disagree with me in the comments on that one. But all of this, I think it's really the thing that makes a good writer great. Anyone can write a scene that does one thing well, but to have a scene that does a whole smorgasbord of things great simultaneously, that is the mark of a master right there. And if you want to be able to write to this level, I just watched a course by Benjamin Percy all about how to write suspense, a key ingredient in any good scene, and it's given me a ton of takeaways I'm applying right now to my novel. He breaks down all kinds of techniques you can use to inject more tension into your scenes, and I'd wholeheartedly recommend it. You can watch it right now if you like, but only on Skillshare, the sponsor of today's video. Over the years, I have learned so much about writing from Skillshare. It has tons of useful courses all about characters and dialogue and any writing topic you may be struggling with. It is a fantastic place to go if you want to hone your craft, and you can binge their entire catalogue right now by clicking my link in the description and being one of the first 1,000 people to grab a free month of Skillshare. There are only so many spots available. Once you're done with Benjamin's course, you can check out my course all about how to write great characters. I give out a bunch of useful tips from writing villains to character arcs that I'm sure you'll find quite useful there. Again, if this interests you, do click my link in the description and grab a free month of Skillshare today. Anyway, back to it. Order 66 is a masterpiece of a scene, but in order to realise the extent of its brilliance, we need to take one massive step back and look at not just the overall Star Wars canon, but at grand, large-scale stories as a whole. Let's move on to part 2, shifting the status quo. When you look at the kind of stories that span decades of real-world time, like the Star Wars saga or Game of Thrones, you'll see the best ones often have what I like to call status quo shifts. You can call them whatever you like, but they're key moments in the story where everything about the story being told gets upended. A great example that comes to mind is in the series Mass Effect. In the first 2 games, the player is going on fun investigations around the galaxy, gallivanting around as this grand threat is slowly being foreshadowed. Then, in the 3rd game, the galaxy is being invaded by this apocalyptic force seeking to end all life. The arrival of the Reapers is a great status quo shift in Mass Effect, as it refreshes the entire story, allowing a previously impossible exploration of the established characters and factions as they navigate their way through this unprecedented situation. And that is what Order 66 was for Star Wars. It was a key moment in the canon that changed the dynamic of every story going forward. It went from the Republic being in charge with Jedi Knights running amok, to now the Empire is in charge with all of the Jedi being hunted. Yes, Order 66 is heartbreaking, but it's also unspeakably refreshing, because from here on, we're getting a totally different flavour of Star Wars. We've been eating the same dish for a while now with the prequels, but now, finally, something fresh is on the menu. Again, Star Wars has another moment like this when the Empire gets defeated in Return of the Jedi. That was another status quo shift that changed the way stories play out thereafter, because now the Empire is gone. It's interesting when you look at the MCU, because I think one of the many reasons why that franchise is flagging so hard right now is because they've been failing to implement this crucial beat that grand scope stories really must include or suffer the consequences. You can only recycle the same story for so long before the audience loses interest. I do have to say though that a problem with Star Wars in its current state, something that I really should have put into my How to Save Star Wars video that I kind of regret now, is we haven't had anything like this in Star Wars for a while now. The Empire fell a very long time ago. It happened in 1983 for Christ's sake. So this universe is long overdue for a big status quo shift, exactly like Order 66. Something that twists the Star Wars formula on its head once again and allows a previously impossible exploration of the characters and factions like the Sith and the Jedi as they adapt to this new dynamic. But it's time to get pretentious, because we're about to break down Shakespeare's Hamlet and how it relates to why Order 66 is such a memorable, impactful moment. Let's move on to part 3, the perfect tragedy. Order 66 is more than just a moment that makes us feel heartbreak. It's more than just a moment that shifts the status quo. It is also a masterclass in how to write tragedy. Now, there are many flavors of tragedy out there. So many, I may one day make an hour-long video essay just breaking tragedy down because it's such a big topic with so much to say on it. But for now, let's focus on the one kind. So, in Revenge of the Sith, Anakin has a secret pregnant wife whom he loves dearly. However, he starts to have nightmares about her death in childbirth. He comes to fear losing her, so he consults Yoda on the matter. And he says,
"Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose."
Now, in a standard hero's journey, Anakin would learn his lesson here, take on Yoda's advice, and overcome this flaw of his. However, he fails to. He's instead tempted by Palpatine by tales of a man who can save those around him from certain death. Palpatine might as well be selling him snake oil here, and he falls for it hook, line, and sinker. Anakin somewhat heeds Yoda's advice as he does inform Mace of Palpatine being a Sith Lord, but he quickly crumbles to temptation, then intervenes, slicing off Mace's hand, saving Palpatine's life, and this leads to him falling to the dark side, leading to Order 66 and the death of the forces of good in the galaxy. Now let's compare that to Hamlet, and let's see if we can identify the similarities. In Hamlet, the Prince of Denmark, Hamlet is visited by the ghost of his late father.
"I have some shocking news. I was murdered. Murdered, I tells ya! As I slept, your Uncle Claudius poured poison in my ear so he could marry your mother and become the king!"
Hamlet, quite understandably, wants revenge for this evil act, but he doesn't know if he should trust the ghost at its word, so he stages a play in front of his uncle, the new king, where the old king on stage is murdered dramatically in the exact same way as the ghost described, and the king shifts in his seat, then gives a strange angry outburst before fleeing from the room.
Give me some light!
Hamlet now has confirmation that yes, his uncle is definitely guilty of this evil act, and not long after, he catches his uncle praying. So Hamlet readies his knife and goes in for the kill. This scene is everything, I think. This scene in Hamlet is just like the one where Anakin cuts off Mace's hand and sides with Palpatine. Both scenes serve the exact same function in the overall tragedy. As Hamlet goes to kill him, he has a revelation.
And so he goes to heaven, and so am I revenged. A villain kills my father, and for that I, his sole son, do this same villain send to heaven.
Because of the religious beliefs in Shakespeare's time, Hamlet believes that if he kills the king while he's praying, he'll be killing him in his most serene state, where he's connected to God, and thus there's a very real chance the king will go to heaven instead of hell. Because of this, Hamlet gets cold feet. Because of this, he spares the king, vowing to wait for an even better opportunity, such as when he's gambling or in a drunken rage. Then he won't be serene. Then he will go to hell when he's killed. It turns out this perfect opportunity never presented itself. This was his one and only chance to do it cleanly. And so the play progresses with Hamlet killing an innocent man by accident, and soon enough the whole thing ends in disaster with pretty much everybody dead. What makes this story all the more tragic is Hamlet was actually wrong in his belief that his uncle would go to heaven if he was killed, because as his uncle says after Hamlet leaves the stage,
"My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go."
his uncle wasn't sincerely praying. So if Hamlet had killed him then, he would have surely gone to hell and everything would have ended well. But what is the similarity here? What do Revenge of the Sith and Hamlet share in common? Well, they're both a kind of tragedy I like to call the moralistic tragedy. You'll know one when you see one because they follow a very simple formula. The protagonist has a flaw, such as being terrified of losing someone he loves. It is his lesson in the story to overcome that flaw. However, he fails. He fails to learn his lesson. He essentially fails his character arc. This manifests itself in a choice the character makes, a choice fueled by their unsurmounted flaw, whether it be Anakin attacking Mace Windu or Hamlet not killing his father's murderer. As a direct consequence of this poor choice, that begets the tragic ending, whether it be Order 66 soon followed by Padme's death, or everyone dying in the end of Hamlet. As a consequence of this, such stories have a pretty clear moral lesson for the audience to learn, ergo why I like to call this one the moralistic tragedy. Now, there are lots of ways to execute a tragedy, but this is one of the most resonant ones you can go for here, because this execution really has a habit of sticking with the audience and making for a satisfying ending, even if it does end in horrible tragedy, for there's incredible meaning to be found in the misery. Now, with Revenge of the Sith, Anakin's flaw was his inability to let go of what he loved. But there's something interesting going on with Hamlet here, because from that rundown I've given, it's way harder to extract Hamlet's critical flaw than it is for Anakin's. And that's because it's written by Shakespeare, so it's so much harder to distill a neat, clean, parable-esque takeaway like we got in Revenge of the Sith. One thing you'll start to notice when you study Shakespeare is how the reason why his stories are still enjoyed today is largely because of his extremely complex characterization. So much so, many of his characters feel like actual, real people. And here's one thing about real people: we're never so two-dimensional as to have only one facet to our psychology. To boil the meaning of decisions made by real people down into one singular, simple reason, it's usually a futile endeavor because we have so many things happening in our brains at any one time, and the same can be said for Hamlet. It's tempting to say the key reason why Hamlet spared his uncle is because of Hamlet's fatal flaw being perfectionism. He was only willing to execute his plans if the truly perfect opportunity came along. Only in life, such opportunities never present themselves, so Hamlet's fatal flaw of perfectionism begot the tragic end. He needed to learn to settle and compromise in order to succeed. And while that's not an incorrect conclusion to make, I think there's so much more to be unpacked right here, because Hamlet had another fatal flaw. He was not a wise man. He didn't understand the minds of others well enough, because if he had, he would have understood his uncle being the deceptive, brother-murdering, regicidal ear poisoner he wasn't in a serene state that allowed him to sincerely pray. This all being said, Anakin did fail to see Palpatine's rather obvious machinations earlier, so maybe it could be said that a general lack of wisdom was also a flaw Anakin had. But more than that, because Shakespeare was so good at writing characters, there's still more to be unpacked from this one beat. While I've never seen anyone have this interpretation of Hamlet, this is what I think his fatal flaw more than anything else was. I think the real reason why Hamlet spared his uncle was because he was afraid to take another man's life. He is a civilized man, a man of moral character and strong conscience, and that very conscience, his societal programming, made him desperately want to not murder this man, despite the fact he was pure evil. His conscience made him so desperate, Hamlet scrambled to find excuses to not kill his uncle, even when his death was absolutely necessary, and he was presented with the perfect opportunity to do the deed.
Thus conscience doth make cowards of us all.
At the end of the day, a tragedy is a highly resonant kind of story. The Greeks and famous playwrights from way back when loved tragedies and wrote them all the time. It just so happens that in modern times, for whatever reason, we just don't tell tragedies anymore, which I think is a crying shame, because all you have to do is look at Revenge of the Sith and Order 66 and how powerful that overall story was to realise that tragedies are a great kind of story. They're very powerful. A hell of a lot more powerful than just watching another generic Marvel movie like Ant-Man 3. And maybe if you're a writer watching, you should consider making your next project a tragedy just like Hamlet or Revenge of the Sith. Very few writers are telling those kinds of stories right now in our pop culture. Stories which have the power to stick with the audience for as long as they live. The kind of story that, if you ask me, we all really could use more of. But if you'd like to be a better writer, I'd strongly recommend you check out Writing Suspense by Benjamin Percy, the course on Skillshare, as well as my course all about how to write great characters. A lot of the tips I give out on this channel I've actually taken from Skillshare courses because I've really found them that useful. It is a brilliant place to go if you want to be a better writer. Do click my link in the description if that interests you. Anyway, thanks for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you guys next time on The Closer Look.